Welcome to my videos. AWS DevOps Engineer, Professional Latest Exam Questions and Answers Set 1. A company wants to migrate its content sharing web application hosted on Amazon EC2 to a serverless architecture. The company currently deploys changes to its application by creating a new auto-scaling group of EC2 instances and a new elastic load balancer, and then shifting the traffic away using an Amazon Route 53 weighted routing policy. For its new serverless application, the company is planning to use Amazon API Gateway and AWS Lambda. The company will need to update its deployment processes to work with the new application. It will also need to retain the ability to test new features on a small number of users before rolling the features out to the entire user base. Which deployment strategy will meet these requirements? Use AWS CDK to deploy API Gateway and Lambda functions. When code needs to be changed, update the AWS CloudFormation stack and deploy the new version of the APIs and Lambda functions. Use a Route 53 failover routing policy for the canary release strategy. Use AWS CloudFormation to deploy API Gateway and Lambda functions using Lambda function versions. When code needs to be changed, update the CloudFormation stack with the new Lambda code and update the API versions using a canary release strategy. Promote the new version when testing is complete. Use AWS Elastic Beanstalk to deploy API Gateway and Lambda functions. When code needs to be changed, deploy a new version of the API and Lambda functions. Shift traffic gradually using an Elastic Beanstalk blue/green deployment. Use AWS OpsWorks to deploy API Gateway and the service layer and Lambda functions in a custom layer. When code needs to be changed, use OpsWorks to perform a blue/green deployment and shift traffic gradually. Correct answer, B. A company's application is currently deployed to a single AWS region. Recently, the company opened a new office on a different continent. The users in the new office are experiencing high latency. The company's application runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB, and uses Amazon DynamoDB as the database layer. The instances run in an EC2 auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. A DevOps engineer is tasked with minimizing application response times and improving availability for users in both regions. Which combination of actions should be taken to address the latency issues? Choose 3. A. Create a new DynamoDB table in the new region with cross-region replication enabled. B. Create new ALB and auto-scaling group global resources and configure the new ALB to direct traffic to the new auto-scaling group. C. Create new ALB and auto-scaling group resources in the new region and configure the new ALB to direct traffic to the new auto-scaling group. D. Create Amazon Route 53 records, health checks, and latency-based routing policies to route to the ALB. E. Create Amazon Route 53 aliases, health checks, and failover routing policies to route to the ALB. F. Convert the DynamoDB table to a global table. Correct answer, C, D, F. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer used an AWS CloudFormation custom resource to set up a D connector. The AWS Lambda function executed and created a D connector, but CloudFormation is not transitioning from create_in_progress to create_complete. Which action should the engineer take to resolve this issue? A. Ensure the Lambda function code has exited successfully. B. Ensure the Lambda function code returns a response to the pre-signed URL. C. Ensure the Lambda function IAM role has CloudFormation update stack permissions for the stack ARN. D. Ensure the Lambda function IAM role has dsconnect directory permissions for the AWS account. A company plans to stop using Amazon EC2 key pairs for SSH access, and instead plans to use AWS Systems Manager Session Manager. To further enhance security, access to Session Manager must take place over a private network only. Which combinations of actions will accomplish this? Choose 2. A. Allow inbound access to TCP port 22 and all associated EC2 security groups from the VPC CIDR range. B. Attach an IAM policy with the necessary Systems Manager permissions to the existing IAM instance profile. C. Create a VPC endpoint for Systems Manager in the desired region. D. Deploy a new EC2 instance that will act as a bastion host to the rest of the EC2 instance fleet. E. Remove any default routes in the associated route tables. Correct answer, B and C. A company runs an application with an Amazon EC2 and on-premises configuration. A DevOps engineer needs to standardize patching across both environments. Company policy dictates that patching only happens during non-business hours. Which combination of actions will meet these requirements? Choose 3. A. Add the physical machines into AWS Systems Manager using Systems Manager hybrid activations. B. Attach an IAM role to the EC2 instances, allowing them to be managed by AWS Systems Manager. C. Create IAM access keys for the on-premises machines to interact with AWS Systems Manager. D. Execute an AWS Systems Manager automation document to patch the systems every hour. E. Use Amazon CloudWatch scheduled events to schedule a patch window. F. Use AWS Systems Manager maintenance windows to schedule a patch window. Correct answer, A, B, F. A company has many applications. Different teams in the company develop the applications by using multiple languages and frameworks. The applications run on premises and on different servers with different operating systems. Each team has its own release protocol and process. The company wants to reduce the complexity of the release and maintenance of these applications. The company is migrating its technology stacks, including these applications, to AWS. The company wants centralized control of source code, a consistent and automatic delivery pipeline, and as few maintenance tasks as possible on the underlying infrastructure. What should a DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? A. Create one AWS code commit repository for all applications. Put each application's code in different branch. Merge the branches, and use AWS code build to build the applications. Use AWS code deploy to deploy the applications to one centralized application server. B. Create one AWS code commit repository for each of the applications. Use AWS code build to build the applications one at a time. Use AWS code deploy to deploy the applications to one centralized application server. C. Create one AWS code commit repository for each of the applications. Use AWS code build to build the applications one at a time to create one AMI for each server. Use AWS CloudFormation stack sets to automatically provision and decommission Amazon EC2 fleets by using these AMIs. D. Create one AWS code commit repository for each of the applications. Use AWS code build to build one Docker image for each application in Amazon Elastic Container Registry, Amazon ECR. Use AWS code deploy to deploy the applications to Amazon Elastic Container Service, Amazon ECS, on infrastructure that AWS Fargate manages. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer is developing an application for a company. The application needs to persist files to Amazon S3. The application needs to upload files with different security classifications that the company defines. These classifications include confidential, private, and public. Files that have a confidential classification must not be viewable by anyone other than the user who uploaded them. The application uses the IAM role of the user to call the S3 API operations. The DevOps engineer has modified the application to add a data classification tag with the value of confidential and an owner tag with the uploading user's ID to each confidential object that is uploaded to Amazon S3. Which set of additional steps must the DevOps engineer take to meet the company's requirements? A. Modify the S3 bucket's ACL to grant bucket owner read access to the uploading user's IAM role. Create an IAM policy that grants S3:get object operations on the S3 bucket when AWS resource tag/data classification equals confidential, and S3:existing object tag/owner equals $AWS, user ID. Attach the policy to the IAM roles for users who require access to the S3 bucket. B. Modify the S3 bucket policy to allow the S3:get object action when AWS resource tag/data classification equals confidential, and S3:existing object tag/owner equals $AWS, user ID. Create an IAM policy that grants S3:get object operations on the S3 bucket. Attach the policy to the IAM roles for users who require access to the S3 bucket. C. Modify the S3 bucket policy to allow the S3:get object action when AWS resource tag/data classification equals confidential, and AWS request tag/owner equals $AWS, user ID. Create an IAM policy that grants S3:get object operations on the S3 bucket. Attach the policy to the IAM roles for users who require access to the S3 bucket. D. Modify the S3 bucket's ACL to grant authenticated read access when AWS resource tag/data classification equals confidential, and S3:existing object tag/owner equals $AWS, user ID. Create an IAM policy that grants S3:get object operations on the S3 bucket. Attach the policy to the IAM roles for users who require access to the S3 bucket. Correct answer, B. A company has developed an AWS Lambda function that handles orders received through an API. The company is using AWS Code Deploy to deploy the Lambda function as the final stage of a C/CD pipeline. A DevOps engineer has noticed there are intermittent failures of the ordering API for a few seconds after deployment. After some investigation, the DevOps engineer believes the failures are due to database changes not having fully propagated before the Lambda function begins executing. How should the DevOps engineer overcome this? A. Add a before allow traffic hook to the AppSpec file that tests and waits for any necessary database changes before traffic can flow to the new version of the Lambda function. B. Add an after allow traffic hook to the AppSpec file that forces traffic to wait for any pending database changes before allowing the new version of the Lambda function to respond. C. Add a before install hook to the AppSpec file that tests and waits for any necessary database changes before deploying the new version of the Lambda function. D. Add a validate service hook to the AppSpec file that inspects incoming traffic and rejects the payload if dependent services, such as the database, are not yet ready. Correct answer, A. A software company wants to automate the build process for a project where the code is stored in GitHub. When the repository is updated, source code should be compiled, tested, and pushed to Amazon S3. Which combination of steps would address these requirements? Choose 3. A. Add a buildspec.yml file to the source code with build instructions. B. Configure a GitHub webhook to trigger a build every time a code change is pushed to the repository. C. Create an AWS code build project with GitHub as the source repository. D. Create an AWS code deploy application with the Amazon EC2/on-premises compute platform. E. Create an AWS OpsWorks deployment with the install dependencies command. F. Provision an Amazon EC2 instance to perform the build. Correct answer, A, B, C. An online retail company based in the United States plans to expand its operations to Europe and Asia in the next 6 months. Its product currently runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer. The instances run in an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. All data is stored in an Amazon Aurora database instance. When the product is deployed in multiple regions, the company wants a single product catalog across all regions, but for compliance purposes, its customer information and purchases must be kept in each region. How should the company meet these requirements with the least amount of application changes? A. Use Amazon Redshift for the product catalog and Amazon DynamoDB tables for the customer information and purchases. B. Use Amazon DynamoDB global tables for the product catalog and regional tables for the customer information and purchases. C. Use Aurora with read replicas for the product catalog and additional local Aurora instances in each region for the customer information and purchases. D. Use Aurora for the product catalog and Amazon DynamoDB global tables for the customer information and purchases. Correct answer, C. A company wants to ensure that their EC2 instances are secure. They want to be notified if any new vulnerabilities are discovered on their instances, and they also want an audit trail of all login activities on the instances. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Use AWS Systems Manager to detect vulnerabilities on the EC2 instances. Install the Amazon Kinesis agent to capture system logs and deliver them to Amazon S3. B. Use AWS Systems Manager to detect vulnerabilities on the EC2 instances. Install the Systems Manager agent to capture system logs and view login activity in the CloudTrail console. C. Configure Amazon CloudWatch to detect vulnerabilities on the EC2 instances. Install the AWS config daemon to capture system logs and view them in the AWS config console. Deconfigure Amazon Inspector to detect vulnerabilities on the EC2 instances. Install the Amazon CloudWatch agent to capture system logs and record them via Amazon CloudWatch logs. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer needs to back up sensitive Amazon S3 objects that are stored within an S3 bucket with a private bucket policy using the S3 cross-region replication functionality. The objects need to be copied to a target bucket in a different AWS region and account. Which actions should be performed to enable this replication? Choose 3. A. Create a replication IAM role in the source account. B. Create a replication IAM role in the target account. C. Add statements to the source bucket policy allowing the replication IAM role to replicate objects. D. Add statements to the target bucket policy allowing the replication IAM role to replicate objects. E. Create a replication rule in the source bucket to enable the replication. F. Create a replication rule in the target bucket to enable the replication. Correct answer, A, D, F. A company is using Amazon EC2 for various workloads. Company policy requires that instances be managed centrally to standardize configurations. These configurations include standard logging, metrics, security assessments, and weekly patching. How can the company meet these requirements? Choose 3. A. Use AWS config to ensure all EC2 instances are managed by Amazon Inspector. B. Use AWS config to ensure all EC2 instances are managed by AWS Systems Manager. C. Use AWS Systems Manager to install and manage Amazon Inspector, Systems Manager Patch Manager, and the Amazon CloudWatch agent on all instances. D. Use Amazon Inspector to install and manage AWS Systems Manager, Systems Manager Patch Manager, and the Amazon CloudWatch agent on all instances. E. Use AWS Systems Manager Maintenance Windows with Systems Manager Run command to schedule Systems Manager Patch Manager tasks. Use the Amazon CloudWatch agent to schedule Amazon Inspector assessment runs. F. Use AWS Systems Manager Maintenance Windows with Systems Manager Run command to schedule Systems Manager Patch Manager tasks. Use Amazon CloudWatch events to schedule Amazon Inspector assessment runs. Correct answer, B, D, E. A business has an application that consists of 5 independent AWS Lambda functions. The DevOps engineer has built a C/CD pipeline using AWS Code Pipeline and AWS Code Build that builds, tests, packages, and deploys each Lambda function in sequence. The pipeline uses an Amazon CloudWatch events rule to ensure the pipeline execution starts as quickly as possible after a change is made to the application source code. After working with the pipeline for a few months, the DevOps engineer has noticed the pipeline takes too long to complete. What should the DevOps engineer implement to best improve the speed of the pipeline? A. Modify the code build projects within the pipeline to use a compute type with more available network throughput. B. Create a custom code build execution environment that includes a symmetric multiprocessing configuration to run the builds in parallel. C. Modify the code pipeline configuration to execute actions for each Lambda function in parallel by specifying the same run order. D. Modify each code build project to run within a VPC and use dedicated instances to increase throughput. Correct answer, C. A company is creating a software solution that executes a specific parallel processing mechanism. The software can scale to tens of servers in some special scenarios. This solution uses a proprietary library that is license-based, requiring that each individual server have a single, dedicated license installed. The company has 200 licenses and is planning to run 200 server nodes concurrently at most. The company has requested the following features: a mechanism to automate the use of the licenses at scale, creation of a dashboard to use in the future to verify which licenses are available at any moment. What is the most effective way to accomplish these requirements? A. Upload the licenses to a private Amazon S3 bucket. Create an AWS CloudFormation template with a mapping section for the licenses. In the template, create an auto-scaling group to launch the servers. In the user data script, acquire an available license from the mapping section. Create an auto-scaling lifecycle hook, then use it to update the mapping after the instance is terminated. B. Upload the licenses to an Amazon DynamoDB table. Create an AWS CloudFormation template that uses an auto-scaling group to launch the servers. In the user data script, acquire an available license from the DynamoDB table. Create an auto-scaling lifecycle hook, then use it to update the mapping after the instance is terminated. C. Upload the licenses to a private Amazon S3 bucket. Populate an Amazon SQS queue with the list of licenses stored in S3. Create an AWS CloudFormation template that uses an auto-scaling group to launch the servers. In the user data script, acquire an available license from SQS. Create an auto-scaling lifecycle hook, then use it to put the license back in SQS after the instance is terminated. D. Upload the licenses to an Amazon DynamoDB table. Create an AWS CLI script to launch the servers by using the parameter count, with min-max instances to launch. In the user data script, acquire an available license from the DynamoDB table. Monitor each instance and, in case of failure, replace the instance, then manually update the DynamoDB table. Correct answer, D. A DevOps engineer administers an application that manages video files for a video production company. The application runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an ELB application load balancer. The instances run in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. Data is stored in an Amazon RDS PostgreSQL multi-auth DB instance, and the video files are stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. On a typical day, 50 gigabytes of new video are added to the S3 bucket. The engineer must implement a multi-region disaster recovery plan with the least data loss and the lowest recovery times. The current application infrastructure is already described using AWS CloudFormation. Which deployment option should the engineer choose to meet the uptime and recovery objectives for the system? A. Launch the application from the CloudFormation template in the second region, which sets the capacity of the auto-scaling group to 1. Create an Amazon RDS read replica in the second region. In the second region, enable cross-region replication between the original S3 bucket and a new S3 bucket. To failover, promote the read replica as master. Update the CloudFormation stack and increase the capacity of the auto-scaling group. B. Launch the application from the CloudFormation template in the second region, which sets the capacity of the auto-scaling group to 1. Create a scheduled task to take daily Amazon RDS cross-region snapshots to the second region. In the second region, enable cross-region replication between the original S3 bucket and Amazon Glacier. In a disaster, launch a new application stack in the second region and restore the database from the most recent snapshot. C. Launch the application from the CloudFormation template in the second region, which sets the capacity of the auto-scaling group to 1. Use Amazon CloudWatch events to schedule a nightly task to take a snapshot of the database, copy the snapshot to the second region, and replace the DB instance in the second region from the snapshot. In the second region, enable cross-region replication between the original S3 bucket and a new S3 bucket. To failover, increase the capacity of the auto-scaling group. D. Use Amazon CloudWatch events to schedule a nightly task to take a snapshot of the database and copy the snapshot to the second region. Create an AWS Lambda function that copies each object to a new S3 bucket in the second region in response to S3 event notifications. In the second region, launch the application from the CloudFormation template and restore the database from the most recent snapshot. Correct answer, A. A company is using AWS Code Pipeline to automate its release pipeline. AWS Code Deploy is being used in the pipeline to deploy an application to Amazon ECS using the blue/green deployment model. The company wants to implement scripts to test the green version of the application before shifting traffic. These scripts will complete in 5 minutes or less. If errors are discovered during these tests, the application must be rolled back. Which strategy will meet these requirements? A. Add a stage to the code pipeline between the source and deploy stages. Use AWS Code Build to create an execution environment and build commands in the build spec file to invoke test scripts. If errors are found, use the AWS deploy stop deployment command to stop the deployment. B. Add a stage to the code pipeline between the source and deploy stages. Use this stage to execute an AWS Lambda function that will run the test scripts. If errors are found, use the AWS deploy stop deployment command to stop the deployment. C. Add a hooks section to the code deploy app spec file. Use the after allow test traffic lifecycle event to invoke an AWS Lambda function to run the test scripts. If errors are found, exit the Lambda function with an error to trigger rollback. D. Add a hooks section to the code deploy app spec file. Use the after allow traffic lifecycle event to invoke the test scripts. If errors are found, use the AWS deploy stop deployment CLI command to stop the deployment. Correct answer, C. A company requires an RPO of 2 hours and an RTO of 10 minutes for its data and application at all times. An application uses a MySQL database and Amazon EC2 web servers. The development team needs a strategy for failover and disaster recovery. Which combination of deployment strategies will meet these requirements? Choose 2. A. Create an Amazon Aurora cluster in one availability zone across multiple regions as the data store. Use Aurora's automatic recovery capabilities in the event of a disaster. B. Create an Amazon Aurora global database in 2 regions as the data store. In the event of a failure, promote the secondary region as the master for the application. C. Create an Amazon Aurora multi-master cluster across multiple regions as the data store. Use the network load balancer to balance the database traffic in different regions. D. Set up the application in 2 regions and use Amazon Route 53 failover-based routing that points to the application load balancers in both regions. Use health checks to determine the availability in a given region. Use auto-scaling groups in each region to adjust capacity based on demand. E. Set up the application in 2 regions and use a multi-region auto-scaling group behind application load balancers to manage the capacity based on demand. In the event of a disaster, adjust the auto-scaling group's desired instance count to increase baseline capacity in the failover region. Correct answer, B, D. An Amazon EC2 instance is running in a virtual private cloud, VPC, and needs to download an object from a restricted Amazon S3 bucket. When the DevOps engineer tries to download, the object and access denied error is received. What are the possible causes for this error? Choose 2. A. The S3 bucket default encryption is enabled. B. There is an error in the S3 bucket policy. C. The object has been moved to Amazon Glacier. D. There is an error in the IAM role configuration. E. S3 versioning is enabled. Correct answer, B, D. A DevOps team manages an API running on premises that serves as a backend for an Amazon API gateway endpoint. Customers have been complaining about high response latencies, which the development team has verified using the API gateway latency metrics in Amazon CloudWatch. To identify the cause, the team needs to collect relevant data without introducing additional latency. Which actions should be taken to accomplish this? Choose to install the CloudWatch agent server-side and configure the agent to upload relevant logs to CloudWatch. B. Enable AWS X-ray tracing in API Gateway. Modify the application to capture request segments, and upload those segments to X-ray during each request. C. Enable AWS X-ray tracing in API Gateway. Modify the application to capture request segments, and use the X-ray daemon to upload segments to X-ray. D. Modify the on-premises application to send log information back to API Gateway with each request. E. Modify the on-premises application to calculate and upload statistical data relevant to the API service requests to CloudWatch metrics. Correct answer, C, E. Welcome to my videos. AWS DevOps Engineer, Professional Latest Exam Questions and Answers Set 2. A DevOps engineer wants to find a solution to migrate an application from on-premises to AWS. The application is running on Linux and needs to run on specific versions of Apache Tomcat, HA proxy, and Varnish cache to function properly. The application's operating system level parameters require tuning. The solution must include a way to automate the deployment of new application versions. The infrastructure should be scalable and faulty servers should be replaced automatically. Which solution should the DevOps engineer use? A. Upload the application as a Docker image that contains all the necessary software to Amazon ECR. Create an Amazon ECS cluster using an AWS Fargate launch type and an auto-scaling group. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses Amazon ECR as a source and Amazon ECS as a deployment provider. B. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with a saved configuration file to configure and install the software. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk web server tier and a load balance type environment that uses the Tomcat solution stack. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and Elastic Beanstalk as a deployment provider. C. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with a set of EB extensions files to configure and install the software. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk Worker tier environment that uses the Tomcat solution stack. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and Elastic Beanstalk as a deployment provider. D. Upload the application code to an AWS code commit repository with an appspec.yml file to configure and install the necessary software. Create an AWS code deployment group associated with an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group. Create an AWS code pipeline that uses code commit as a source and code deploy as a deployment provider. Correct answer, A. A company wants to use AWS CloudFormation for infrastructure deployment. The company has strict tagging and resource requirements and wants to limit the deployment to 2 regions. Developers will need to deploy multiple versions of the same application. Which solution ensures resources are deployed in accordance with company policy? A. Create AWS Trusted Advisor checks to find and remediate unapproved CloudFormation stack sets. B. Create a CloudFormation drift detection operation to find and remediate unapproved CloudFormation stack sets. C. Create CloudFormation stack sets with approved CloudFormation templates. D. Create AWS Service Catalog products with approved CloudFormation templates. Correct answer, C. A DevOps engineer must track the health of a stateless RESTful service sitting behind a classic load balancer. The deployment of new application revisions is through a C/CD pipeline. If the service's latency increases beyond a defined threshold, deployment should be stopped until the service has recovered. Which of the following methods allow for the quickest detection time? A. Use Amazon CloudWatch metrics provided by Elastic Load Balancing to calculate average latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. B. Use AWS Lambda and Elastic Load Balancing access logs to detect average latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. C. Use AWS code deploys minimum healthy host setting to define thresholds for rolling back deployments. If these thresholds are breached, roll back the deployment. D. Use metric filters to parse application logs in Amazon CloudWatch logs. Create a filter for latency. Alarm and stop deployment when latency increases beyond the defined threshold. Correct answer, C. An AWS code pipeline has implemented a code release process. The pipeline is integrated with AWS Code Deploy to deploy versions of an application to multiple Amazon EC2 instances for each code pipeline stage. During a recent deployment, the pipeline failed due to a code deploy issue. The DevOps team wants to improve monitoring and notifications during deployment to decrease resolution times. What should the DevOps engineer do to create notifications when issues are discovered? A. Implement AWS CloudWatch logs for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an AWS config rule to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. B. Implement AWS CloudWatch events for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an AWS Lambda function to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. C. Implement AWS CloudTrail to record code pipeline and code deploy API call information. Create an AWS Lambda function to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. D. Implement AWS CloudWatch events for code pipeline and code deploy. Create an Amazon Inspector assessment target to evaluate code deployment issues, and create an Amazon SNS topic to notify stakeholders of deployment issues. Correct answer, B. A development team is using AWS Code Commit to version control application code and AWS Code Pipeline to orchestrate software deployments. The team has decided to use a remote master branch as the trigger for the pipeline to integrate code changes. A developer has pushed code changes to the code commit repository, but noticed that the pipeline had no reaction, even after 10 minutes. Which of the following actions should be taken to troubleshoot this issue? A. Check that an Amazon CloudWatch events rule has been created for the master branch to trigger the pipeline. B. Check that the code pipeline service rule has permission to access the code commit repository. C. Check that the developer's IAM role has permission to push to the code commit repository. D. Check to see if the pipeline failed to start because of code commit errors in Amazon CloudWatch logs. Correct answer, A. A DevOps engineer is deploying a new version of a company's application in an AWS Code Deploy deployment group associated with its Amazon EC2 instances. After some time, the deployment fails. The engineer realizes that all the events associated with the specific deployment ID are in a skipped status, and code was not deployed in the instances associated with the deployment group. What are valid reasons for this failure? Choose 2. A. The networking configuration does not allow the EC2 instances to reach the Internet via a NAT gateway or Internet gateway, and the code deploy endpoint cannot be reached. B. The IAM user who triggered the application deployment does not have permission to interact with the code deploy endpoint. C. The target EC2 instances were not properly registered with the code deploy endpoint. D. An instance profile with proper permissions was not attached to the target EC2 instances. E. The appspec.yml file was not included in the application revision. Correct answer, B and C. A company has an application that is using a MySQL-compatible Amazon or multi-OS DB cluster as the database. A cross-region read replica has been created for disaster recovery purposes. A DevOps engineer wants to automate the promotion of the replica so it becomes the primary database instance in the event of a failure. Which solution will accomplish this? A. Configure a latency-based Amazon Route 53 CNAME with health checks so it points to both the primary and replica endpoints. Subscribe an Amazon SNS topic to Amazon RDS failure notifications from AWS CloudTrail and use that topic to trigger an AWS Lambda function that will promote the replica instance as the master. B. Create an or a custom endpoint to point to the primary database instance. Configure the application to use this endpoint. Configure AWS CloudTrail to run an AWS Lambda function to promote the replica instance and modify the custom endpoint to point to the newly promoted instance. C. Create an AWS Lambda function to modify the application's AWS CloudFormation template to promote the replica, apply the template to update the stack, and point the application to the newly promoted instance. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm to trigger this Lambda function after the failure event occurs. D. Store the Aurora endpoint in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event that defects the database failure and runs an AWS Lambda function to promote the replica instance and update the endpoint URL stored in AWS Systems Manager Parameter Store. Code the application to reload the endpoint from Parameter Store if a database connection fails. Correct answer, B. An application has microservices spread across different AWS accounts and is integrated with an on-premises legacy system for some of its functionality. Because of the segmented architecture and missing logs, every time the application experiences issues, it is taking too long to gather the logs to identify the issues. A DevOps engineer must fix the log aggregation process and provide a way to centrally analyze the logs. Which is the most efficient and cost-effective solution? A. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Use the Amazon S3 API to export on-premises logs, and store the logs in an S3 bucket in a central account. Build an Amazon EMR cluster to reduce the logs and derive the root cause. B. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Use the Amazon S3 API to import on-premises logs. Store all logs in S3 buckets in individual accounts. Use Amazon Macy to write a query to search for the required specific event-related data point. C. Collect system logs and application logs using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Install the CloudWatch Logs agent on the on-premises servers. Transfer all logs from AWS to the on-premises data center. Use an Amazon Elasticsearch Logs Kibana stack to analyze logs on premises. D. Collect system logs and application logs by using the Amazon CloudWatch Logs agent. Install a CloudWatch Logs agent for on-premises resources. Store all logs in an S3 bucket in a central account. Set up an Amazon S3 trigger and an AWS Lambda function to analyze incoming logs and automatically identify anomalies. Use Amazon Athena to run ad hoc queries on the logs in the central account. Correct answer, D. A company's DevOps engineer is working in a multi-account environment. The company uses AWS Transit Gateway to route all outbound traffic through a network operations account. In the network operations account, all account traffic passes through a firewall appliance for inspection before the traffic goes to an internet gateway. The firewall appliance sends logs to Amazon CloudWatch Logs and includes event severities of critical, high, medium, low, and info. The security team wants to receive an alert if any critical events occur. What should the DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? A. Create an Amazon CloudWatch Synthetics Canary to monitor the firewall state. If the firewall reaches a critical state or logs a critical event, use a CloudWatch alarm to publish a notification to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. B. Create an Amazon CloudWatch Medic filter by using a search for critical events. Publish a custom metric for the finding. Use a CloudWatch alarm based on the custom metric to publish a notification to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. C. Enable Amazon Guard Duty in the network operations account. Configure Guard Duty to monitor flow logs. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event rule that is invoked by Guard Duty events that are critical. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as a target. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. D. Use AWS Firewall Manager to apply consistent policies across all accounts. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event rule that is invoked by Firewall Manager events that are critical. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as a target. Subscribe the security team's email address to the topic. Correct answer, C. A company recently migrated its legacy application from on-premises to AWS. The application is hosted on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, which is behind Amazon API Gateway. The company wants to ensure users experience minimal disruptions during any deployment of a new version of the application. The company also wants to ensure it can quickly roll back updates if there is an issue. Which solution will meet these requirements with minimal changes to the application? A. Introduce changes as a separate environment parallel to the existing one. Configure API Gateway to use a canary release deployment to send a small subset of user traffic to the new environment. B. Introduce changes as a separate environment parallel to the existing one. Update the application's DNS alias records to point to the new environment. C. Introduce changes as a separate target group behind the existing application load balancer. Configure API Gateway to route user traffic to the new target group in steps. D. Introduce changes as a separate target group behind the existing application load balancer. Configure API Gateway to route all traffic to the application load balancer, which then sends the traffic to the new target group. Correct answer, C. A company recently launched an application that is more popular than expected. The company wants to ensure the application can scale to meet increasing demands and provide reliability using multiple availability zones, AZs. The application runs on a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. A DevOps engineer has created an auto-scaling group across multiple AZs for the application. Instances launched in the newly added AZs are not receiving any traffic for the application. What is likely causing this issue? A. Auto-scaling groups can create new instances in a single AZ only. B. The EC2 instances have not been manually associated to the ALB. C. The ALB should be replaced with a network load balancer, NLB. D. The new AZ has not been added to the ALB. Correct answer, D. A DevOps engineer manages a web application that runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. The instances run in an EC2 auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. The engineer needs to implement a deployment strategy that launches a second fleet of instances with the same capacity as the original fleet. Maintains the original fleet unchanged while the second fleet is launched. Transitions traffic to the second fleet when the second fleet is fully deployed. Terminates the original fleet automatically 1 hour after transition. Which solution will satisfy these requirements? A. Use an AWS CloudFormation template with a retention policy for the ALB set to 1 hour. Update the Amazon Route 53 record to reflect the new ALB. B. Use 2 AWS Elastic Beanstalk environments to perform a blue/green deployment from the original environment to the new one. Create an application version lifecycle policy to terminate the original environment in 1 hour. C. Use AWS Code Deploy with a deployment group configured with a blue/green deployment configuration. Select the option Terminate the original instances in the deployment group with a waiting period of 1 hour. D. Use AWS Elastic Beanstalk with the configuration set to immutable. Create an EB extension using the resources key that sets the deletion policy of the ALB to 1 hour, and deploy the application. Correct answer, C. A healthcare services company is concerned about the growing costs of software licensing for an application for monitoring patient wellness. The company wants to create an audit process to ensure that the application is running exclusively on Amazon EC2 dedicated hosts. A DevOps engineer must create a workflow to audit the application to ensure compliance. What steps should the engineer take to meet this requirement with the least administrative overhead? A. Use AWS Systems Manager Configuration Compliance. Use calls to the Put Compliance Items API action to scan and build a database of non-compliant EC2 instances based on their host placement configuration. Use an Amazon DynamoDB table to store these instance IDs for fast access. Generate a report through Systems Manager by calling the List Compliance Summaries API action. B. Use custom Java code running on an EC2 instance. Set up EC2 auto-scaling for the instance depending on the number of instances to be checked. Send the list of non-compliant EC2 instance IDs to an Amazon SQS queue. Set up another worker instance to process instance IDs from the SQS queue and write them to Amazon DynamoDB. Use an AWS Lambda function to terminate non-compliant instance IDs obtained from the queue, and send them to an Amazon SNS email topic for distribution. Use AWS config. Identify all EC2 instances to be audited by enabling config recording on all Amazon EC2 resources for the region. Create a custom AWS config rule that triggers an AWS Lambda function by using the config rule change triggered blueprint. Modify the Lambda evaluate compliance function to verify host placement to return a non-compliant result if the instance is not running on an EC2 dedicated host. Use the AWS config report to address non-compliant instances. Use AWS CloudTrail. Identify all EC2 instances to be audited by analyzing all calls to the EC2 run command API action. Invoke an AWS Lambda function that analyzes the host placement of the instance. Store the EC2 instance ID of non-compliant resources in an Amazon RDS MySQL DB instance. Generate a report by querying the RDS instance and exporting the query results to a CSV text file. Correct answer, C. A company has 100 gigabytes of log data in an Amazon S3 bucket stored in CSV format. SQL developers want to query this data and generate graphs to visualize it. They also need an efficient, automated way to store metadata from the CSV file. Which combination of steps should be taken to meet these requirements with the least amount of effort? Choose 3. A. Filter the data through AWS X-Ray to visualize the data. B. Filter the data through Amazon QuickSight to visualize the data. C. Query the data with Amazon Athena. D. Query the data with Amazon Redshift. E. Use AWS Glue as the persistent metadata store. F. Use Amazon S3 as the persistent metadata store. Correct answer, B, C, F. A DevOps engineer has several legacy applications that all generate different log formats. The engineer must standardize the formats before writing them to Amazon S3 for querying and analysis. How can this requirement be met at the lowest cost? A. Have the application send its logs to an Amazon EMR cluster and normalize the logs before sending them to Amazon S3. B. Have the application send its logs to Amazon QuickSight, then use the Amazon QuickSight Spice engine to normalize the logs. Do the analysis directly from Amazon QuickSight. C. Keep the logs in Amazon S3 and use Amazon Redshift Spectrum to normalize the logs in place. D. Use Amazon Kinesis Agent on each server to upload the logs and have Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose use an AWS Lambda function to normalize the logs before writing them to Amazon S3. Correct answer, D. A company needs to implement a robust C/CD pipeline to automate the deployment of an application in AWS. The pipeline must support continuous integration, continuous delivery, and automatic rollback upon deployment failure. The entire C/CD pipeline must be capable of being reprovisioned in alternate AWS accounts or regions within minutes. A DevOps engineer has already created an AWS code commit repository to store the source code. Which combination of actions should be taken when building this pipeline to meet these requirements? Choose 3. A. Configure an AWS code pipeline with a build stage using AWS code build. B. Copy the build artifact from code commit to Amazon S3. C. Create an auto-scaling group of Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB, and set the ALB as the deployment target in AWS code pipeline. D. Create an AWS Elastic Beanstalk environment as the deployment target in AWS code pipeline. E. Implement an Amazon SQS queue to decouple the pipeline components. F. Provision all resources using AWS CloudFormation. Correct answer, A, B, D. A company is building a solution for storing files containing personally identifiable information, PII, on AWS. Requirements state, all data must be encrypted at rest and in transit. All data must be replicated in at least 2 locations that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Which solution meets these requirements? A. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate availability zones that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce Amazon S3 SSEC on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the 2 buckets. B. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate AWS regions that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce S3 managed keys, SSC S3, on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the 2 buckets. C. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate AWS regions that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use an IAM role to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce Amazon S3 managed keys, SSC S3, on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the 2 buckets. D. Create primary and secondary Amazon S3 buckets in 2 separate availability zones that are at least 500 miles, 805 kilometers, apart. Use a bucket policy to enforce access to the buckets only through HTTPS. Use a bucket policy to enforce AWS KMS encryption on all objects uploaded to the bucket. Configure cross-region replication between the 2 buckets. Create a KMS customer master key, CMK, in the primary region for encrypting objects. Correct answer, B. A company is using an AWS code build project to build and package an application. The packages are copied to a shared Amazon S3 bucket before being deployed across multiple AWS accounts. The buildspec.yml file contains the following. The DevOps engineer has noticed that anybody with an AWS account is able to download the artifacts. What steps should the DevOps engineer take to stop this? The DevOps engineer has noticed that anybody with an AWS account is able to download the artifacts. What steps should the DevOps engineer take to stop this? A. Modify the post_build to command to use a public read and configure a bucket policy that grants read access to the relevant AWS accounts only. B. Configure a default ACL for the S3 bucket that defines the set of authenticated users as the relevant AWS accounts only and grants read-only access. C. Create an S3 bucket policy that grants read access to the relevant AWS accounts and denies read access to the principal. D. Modify the post_build command to remove authenticated read and configure a bucket policy that allows read access to the relevant AWS accounts only. Correct answer, A. A DevOps engineer needs to grant several external contractors access to a legacy application that runs on an Amazon Linux Amazon EC2 instance. The application server is available only in a private subnet. The contractors are not authorized for VPN access. What should the DevOps engineer do to grant the contractors access to the application server? A. Create an IAM user and SSH keys for each contractor. Add the public SSH key to the application server's SSH authorized _keys file. Instruct the contractors to install the AWS CLI and AWS Systems Manager Session Manager plugin, update their AWS credentials files with their private keys, and use the AWS SSM start session command to gain access to the target application server instance ID. B. Ask each contractor to securely send their SSH public key. Add this public key to the application server's SSH authorized keys file. Instruct the contractors to use their private key to connect to the application server through SSH. C. Ask each contractor to securely send their SSH public key. Use EC2 pairs to import their key. Update the application server's SSH authorized _keys file. Instruct the contractors to use their private key to connect to the application server through SSH. D. Create an IAM user for each contractor with programmatic access. Add each user to an IAM group that has a policy that allows the SSM start session action. Instruct the contractors to install the AWS CLI and AWS Systems Manager Session Manager plugin, update their AWS credentials files with their access keys, and use the AWS SSM start session to gain access to the target application server instance ID. Correct answer, B. A company hosts its staging website using an Amazon EC2 instance backed with Amazon EBS storage. The company wants to recover quickly with minimal data losses in the event of network connectivity issues or power failures on the EC2 instance. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Add the instance to an EC2 auto-scaling group with the minimum, maximum, and desired capacity set to 1. B. Add the instance to an EC2 auto-scaling group with a lifecycle hook to detach the EBS volume when the EC2 instance shuts down or terminates. C. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the status check failed_system metric and select the EC2 action to recover the instance. D. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the status check failed_instance metric and select the EC2 action to reboot the instance. Correct answer, C. Welcome to my videos. AWS DevOps Engineer, Professional Latest Exam Questions and Answers Set 3. A company has built a web service that runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. The company has deployed the application in AS East 1. Amazon Route 53 provides an external DNS that routes traffic from example.com to the application, created with appropriate health checks. The company has deployed a second environment for the application in EU West 1. The company wants traffic to be routed to whichever environment results in the best response time for each user. If there is an outage in one region, traffic should be directed to the other environment. Which configuration will achieve these requirements? A. A subdomain us.example.com with weighted routing, the US ALB with weight 2 and the EU ALB with weight 1. Another subdomain eu.example.com with weighted routing, the EU ALB with weight 2 and the US ALB with weight 1. Geolocation routing records for example.com, North America alias to us.example.com and Europe alias to eu.example.com. B. A subdomain us.example.com with latency-based routing, the US ALB as the first target and the EU ALB as the second target. Another subdomain eu.example.com with latency-based routing, the EU ALB as the first target and the US ALB as the second target. Failover routing records for example.com alias to us.example.com as the first target and eu.example.com as the second target. C. A subdomain us.example.com with failover routing, the US ALB as primary and the EU ALB as secondary. Another subdomain eu.example.com with failover routing, the EU ALB as primary and the US ALB as secondary. Latency-based routing records for example.com that are alias to us.example.com and eu.example.com. D. A subdomain us.example.com with multi-value answer routing, the US ALB first and the EU ALB second. Another subdomain eu.example.com with multi-value answer routing, the EU ALB first and the US ALB second. Failover routing records for example.com that are alias to us.example.com and eu.example.com. Correct answer, C. A company has multiple development teams sharing one AWS account. The development team's manager wants to be able to automatically stop Amazon EC2 instances and receive notifications if resources are idle and not tagged as production resources. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Use a scheduled Amazon CloudWatch events rule to filter for Amazon EC2 instance status checks and identify idle EC2 instances. Use the CloudWatch events rule to target an AWS Lambda function to stop non-production instances and send notifications. B. Use the scheduled Amazon CloudWatch events rule to filter AWS Systems Manager events and identify idle EC2 instances and resources. Use the CloudWatch events rule to target an AWS Lambda function to stop non-production instances and send notifications. C. Use a scheduled Amazon CloudWatch events rule to target a custom AWS Lambda function that runs AWS Trusted Advisor checks. Create a second CloudWatch events rule to filter events from Trusted Advisor to trigger a Lambda function to stop idle non-production instances and send notifications. D. Use the scheduled Amazon CloudWatch events rule to target Amazon Inspector events for idle EC2 instances. Use the CloudWatch events rule to target the AWS Lambda function to stop non-production instances and send notifications. Correct answer, C. An N-tier application requires a table in an Amazon RDS MySQL DB instance to be dropped and repopulated at each deployment. This process can take several minutes and the web tier cannot come online until the process is complete. Currently, the web tier is configured in an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group, with instances being terminated and replaced at each deployment. The MySQL table is populated by running a SQL query through an AWS code build job. What should be done to ensure that the web tier does not come online before the database is completely configured? A. Use Amazon Aurora as a drop-in replacement for RDS MySQL. Use snapshots to populate the table with the correct data. B. Modify the launch configuration of the auto-scaling group to pause user data execution for 600 seconds, allowing the table to be populated. C. Use AWS step functions to monitor and maintain the state of data population. Mark the database in service before continuing with the deployment. D. Use an EC2 auto-scaling lifecycle hook to pause the configuration of the web tier until the table is populated. Correct answer, D. A highly regulated company has a policy that DevOps engineers should not log into their Amazon EC2 instances except in emergencies. If a DevOps engineer does log in, the security team must be notified within 15 minutes of the occurrence. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Install the Amazon Inspector agent on each EC2 instance. Subscribe to Amazon CloudWatch events notifications. Trigger an AWS Lambda function to check if a message is about user logins. If it is, send a notification to the security team using Amazon SNS. B. Install the Amazon CloudWatch agent on each EC2 instance. Configure the agent to push all logs to Amazon CloudWatch logs and set up a CloudWatch metric filter that searches for user logins. If a login is found, send a notification to the security team using Amazon SNS. C. Set up AWS CloudTrail with Amazon CloudWatch logs. Subscribe CloudWatch logs to Amazon Kinesis. Attach AWS Lambda to Kinesis to parse and determine if a log contains a user login. If it does, send a notification to the security team using Amazon SNS. D. Set up a script on each Amazon EC2 instance to push all logs to Amazon S3. Set up an S3 event to trigger an AWS Lambda function, which triggers an Amazon Athena query to run. The Athena query checks for logins and sends the output to the security team using Amazon SNS. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer has automated a web service deployment by using AWS code pipeline with the following steps. 1. An AWS code build project compiles the deployment artifact and runs unit tests. 2. An AWS code deploy deployment group deploys the web service to Amazon EC2 instances in the staging environment. 3. A code deploy deployment group deploys the web service to EC2 instances in the production environment. The quality assurance (QA) team requests permission to inspect the build artifact before the deployment to the production environment occurs. The QA team wants to run an internal penetration testing tool to conduct manual tests. The tool will be invoked by a REST API call. Which combination of actions should the DevOps engineer take to fulfill this request? Choose 2. A. Insert a manual approval action between the test actions and deployment actions of the pipeline. B. Modify the buildspec.yml file for the compilation stage to require manual approval before completion. C. Update the code deploy deployment groups so that they require manual approval to proceed. D. Update the pipeline to directly call the REST API for the penetration testing tool. E. Update the pipeline to invoke a Lambda function that calls the REST API for the penetration testing tool. Correct answer, B and C. A DevOps engineer manages a large commercial website that runs on Amazon EC2. The website uses Amazon Kinesis data streams to collect and process web logs. The DevOps engineer manages the Kinesis consumer application, which also runs on Amazon EC2. Sudden increases of data cause the Kinesis consumer application to fall behind, and the Kinesis data streams drop records before the records can be processed. The DevOps engineer must implement a solution to improve stream handling. Which solution meets these requirements with the most operational efficiency? A. Modify the Kinesis consumer application to store the logs durably in Amazon S3. Use Amazon EMR to process the data directly on Amazon S3 to derive customer insights. Store the results in Amazon S3. B. Horizontally scale the Kinesis consumer application by adding more EC2 instances based on the Amazon CloudWatch getRecords.iteratorAge milliseconds metric. Increase the retention period of the Kinesis data streams. C. Convert the Kinesis consumer application to run as an AWS Lambda function. Configure the Kinesis data streams as the event source for the Lambda function to process the data streams. D. Increase the number of shards in the Kinesis data streams to increase the overall throughput so that the consumer application processes data faster. Correct answer, B. A company uses AWS organizations to manage multiple accounts. Information security policies require that all unencrypted Amazon EBS volumes be marked as non-compliant. A DevOps engineer needs to automatically deploy the solution and ensure that this compliance check is always present. Which solution will accomplish this? A. Create an AWS CloudFormation template that defines an AWS inspector rule to check whether EBS encryption is enabled. Save the template to an Amazon S3 bucket that has been shared with all accounts within the company. Update the account creation script pointing to the CloudFormation template in Amazon S3. B. Create an AWS config organizational rule to check whether EBS encryption is enabled and deploy the rule using the AWS CLI. Create and apply an SCP to prohibit stopping and deleting AWS config across the organization. C. Create an SCP in organizations. Set the policy to prevent the launch of Amazon EC2 instances without encryption on the EBS volumes using a conditional expression. Apply the SCP to all AWS accounts. Use Amazon Athena to analyze the AWS CloudTrail output, looking for events that deny an EC2:run instances action. D. Deploy an IAM role to all accounts from a single trusted account. Build a pipeline with AWS Code Pipeline with a stage in AWS Lambda to assume the IAM role, and list all EBS volumes in the account. Publish a report to Amazon S3. Correct answer, B. A company develops and maintains a web application using Amazon EC2 instances and an Amazon RDS for SQL Server DB instance in a single availability zone. The resources need to run only when new deployments are being tested using AWS Code Pipeline. Testing occurs one or more times a week and each test takes 2 to 3 hours to run. A DevOps engineer wants a solution that does not change the architecture components. Which solution will meet these requirements in the most cost-effective manner? A. Convert the RDS database to an Amazon Aurora serverless database. Use an AWS Lambda function to start and stop the EC2 instances before and after tests. B. Put the EC2 instances into an autoscaling group. Schedule scaling to run at the start of the deployment tests. C. Replace the EC2 instances with EC2 spot instances and the RDS database with an RDS reserved instance. D. Subscribe Amazon CloudWatch events to Code Pipeline to trigger AWS Systems Manager automation documents that start and stop all EC2 and RDS instances before and after deployment tests. Correct answer, B. A company runs several applications across multiple AWS accounts in an organization in AWS organizations. Some of the resources are not tagged properly and the company's finance team cannot determine which costs are associated with which applications. A DevOps engineer must remediate this issue and prevent this issue from happening in the future. Which combination of actions should the DevOps engineer take to meet these requirements? Choose 2. A. Activate the user-defined cost allocation tags in each AWS account. B. Create and attach an SCP that requires a specific tag. C. Define each line of business, LOB, in AWS budgets. Assign the required tag to each resource. D. Scan all accounts with Tag Editor. Assign the required tag to each resource. E. Use the budget report to find untagged resources. Assign the required tag to each resource. Correct answer, B. A company runs several applications across multiple AWS accounts in an organization in AWS organizations. Some of the resources are not tagged properly and the company's finance team cannot determine which costs are associated with which applications. A DevOps engineer must remediate this issue and prevent this issue from happening in the future. Which combination of actions should the DevOps engineer take to meet these requirements? Choose 2. A. Activate the user-defined cost allocation tags in each AWS account. B. Create and attach an SCP that requires a specific tag. C. Define each line of business, LOB, in AWS budgets. Assign the required tag to each resource. D. Scan all accounts with Tag Editor. Assign the required tag to each resource. E. Use the budget report to find untagged resources. Assign the required tag to each resource. Correct answer, C and D. An online company uses Amazon EC2 auto-scaling extensively to provide an excellent customer experience while minimizing the number of running EC2 instances. The company's self-hosted Puppet environment in the application layer manages the configuration of the instances. The IT manager wants the lowest licensing costs and wants to ensure that whenever the EC2 auto-scaling group scales down, removed EC2 instances are deregistered from the Puppet master as soon as possible. How can the requirement be met? A. At instance launch time, use EC2 user data to deploy the AWS Code Deploy agent. Use Code Deploy to install the Puppet agent. When the auto-scaling group scales out, run a script to register the newly deployed instances to the Puppet master. When the auto-scaling group scales in, use the EC2 auto-scaling EC2_instance_terminating lifecycle hook to trigger deregistration from the Puppet master. B. Bake the AWS Code Deploy agent into the base AMI. When the auto-scaling group scales out, use Code Deploy to install the Puppet agent, and execute a script to register the newly deployed instances to the Puppet master. When the auto-scaling group scales in, use the Code Deploy application stop lifecycle hook to run a script to deregister the instance from the Puppet master. C. At instance launch time, use EC2 user data to deploy the AWS Code Deploy agent. When the auto-scaling group scales out, use Code Deploy to install the Puppet agent, and run a script to register the newly deployed instances to the Puppet master. When the auto-scaling group scales in, use the EC2 user data instance stop script to run a script to deregister the instance from the Puppet master. Debake the AWS Systems Manager agent into the base AMI. When the auto-scaling group scales out, use the AWS Systems Manager to install the Puppet agent, and run a script to register the newly deployed instances to the Puppet master. When the auto-scaling group scales in, use the Systems Manager instance stop lifecycle hook to run a script to deregister the instance from the Puppet master. Correct answer, B. A company uses a series of individual Amazon CloudFormation templates to deploy its multi-region applications. These templates must be deployed in a specific order. The company is making more changes to the templates than previously expected and wants to deploy new templates more efficiently. Additionally, the data engineering team must be notified of all changes to the templates. What should the company do to accomplish these goals? A. Create an AWS Lambda function to deploy the CloudFormation templates in the required order. Use stack policies to alert the data engineering team. B. Host the CloudFormation templates in Amazon S3. Use Amazon S3 events to directly trigger CloudFormation updates and Amazon SNS notifications. C. Implement CloudFormation stack sets and use drift detection to trigger update alerts to the data engineering team. D. Leverage CloudFormation nested stacks and stack sets for deployments. Use Amazon SNS to notify the data engineering team. Correct answer, D. A company is running an application on Amazon EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group. Recently, an issue occurred that prevented EC2 instances from launching successfully, and it took several hours for the support team to discover the issue. The support team wants to be notified by email whenever an EC2 instance does not start successfully. Which action will accomplish this? A. Add a health check to the autoscaling group to invoke an AWS Lambda function whenever an instance status is impaired. B. Configure the autoscaling group to send a notification to an Amazon SNS topic whenever a failed instance launch occurs. C. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm that invokes an AWS Lambda function when a failed attach instance's autoscaling API call is made. D. Create a status check alarm on Amazon EC2 to send a notification to an Amazon SNS topic whenever a status check fail occurs. Correct answer, B. A company uses AWS Storage Gateway and File Gateway mode in front of an Amazon S3 bucket that is used by multiple resources. In the morning when business begins, users do not see the objects processed by a third party the previous evening. When a DevOps engineer looks directly at the S3 bucket, the data is there, but it is missing in Storage Gateway. Which solution ensures that all the updated third-party files are available in the morning? A. Configure a nightly Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch events, event to trigger an AWS Lambda function to run the refresh cache command for Storage Gateway. B. Instruct the third party to put data into the S3 bucket using AWS Transfer for SFTP. C. Modify Storage Gateway to run in Volume Gateway mode. D. Use S3 same region replication to replicate any changes made directly in the S3 bucket to Storage Gateway. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer sets up two Amazon S3 event notifications for an S3 bucket from the S3 console. Both event notifications will be invoked when an object put action occurs. One event notification will invoke an AWS Lambda function if the file suffix is CSV. Another event notification will invoke an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic if the file suffix is XLSX. The DevOps engineer notices that files with the CSV suffix can invoke the Lambda function successfully. However, files with the XLSX suffix cannot invoke the SNS topic. Which reason explains why the SNS topic is not invoked when XLSX files are added to the S3 bucket? A. Only one event notification is allowed from the S3 console. B. Amazon S3 needs proper permissions to publish an event notification to Amazon SNS. C. Lambda has precedence over Amazon SNS in handling the event notification. D. Amazon SNS is not a valid destination for some S3 event notifications, including object put. Correct answer, B. A rapidly growing company wants to scale for developer demand for AWS development environments. Development environments are created manually in the AWS Management Console. The networking team uses AWS CloudFormation to manage the networking infrastructure, exporting stack output values for the Amazon VPC and all subnets. The development environments have common standards, such as application load balancers, Amazon EC2 auto-scaling groups, security groups, and Amazon DynamoDB tables. To keep up with the demand, the DevOps engineer wants to automate the creation of development environments. Because the infrastructure required to support the application is expected to grow, there must be a way to easily update the deployed infrastructure. CloudFormation will be used to create a template for the development environments. Which approach will meet these requirements and quickly provide consistent AWS environments for developers? A. Use import value intrinsic functions in the resources section of the template to retrieve virtual private cloud, VPC, and subnet values. Use CloudFormation stack sets for the development environments, using the count input parameter to indicate the number of environments needed. Use the update stack set command to update existing development environments. B. Use nested stacks to define common infrastructure components. To access the exported values, use template URL to reference the networking team's template. To retrieve virtual private cloud, VPC, and subnet values. Use fn:\import value intrinsic functions in the parameters section of the master template. Use the create change set and execute change set commands to update existing development environments. Use nested stacks to define common infrastructure components. Use fn:\import value intrinsic functions with the resources of the nested stack to retrieve virtual private cloud, VPC, and subnet values. Use the create change set and execute change set commands to update existing development environments. Use fn:\import value intrinsic functions in the parameters section of the master template to retrieve virtual private cloud, VPC, and subnet values. Define the development resources in the order they need to be created in the CloudFormation nested stacks. Use the create change set and execute change set commands to update existing development environments. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer notices that all Amazon EC2 instances running behind an application load balancer in an autoscaling group are failing to respond to user requests. The EC2 instances are also failing target group HTTP health checks. Upon inspection, the engineer notices the application process was not running in any EC2 instances. There are a significant number of out-of-memory messages in the system logs. The engineer needs to improve the resilience of the application to cope with a potential application memory leak. Monitoring and notifications should be enabled to alert when there is an issue. Which combination of actions will meet these requirements? Choose 2. A. Change the auto-scaling configuration to replace the instances when they fail the load balancer's health checks. B. Change the target group health check interval seconds parameter to reduce the interval between health checks. C. Change the target group health checks from HTTP to TCP to check if the port where the application is listening is reachable. D. Enable the available memory consumption metric within the Amazon CloudWatch dashboard for the entire auto-scaling group. Create an alarm when the memory utilization is high. Associate an Amazon SNS topic to the alarm to receive notifications when the alarm goes off. Use the Amazon CloudWatch agent to collect the memory utilization of the EC2 instances in the auto-scaling group. Create an alarm when the memory utilization is high and associate an Amazon SNS topic to receive a notification. Correct answer, D, E. A company wants to migrate a legacy application to AWS and develop a deployment pipeline that uses AWS services only. A DevOps engineer is migrating all of the application code from a Git repository to AWS code commit while preserving the history of the repository. The DevOps engineer has set all the permissions within code commit, installed the Git client and the AWS CLI on a local computer, and is ready to migrate the repository. Which actions will follow? A. Create the code commit repository using the AWS CLI. Clone the Git repository directly to code commit using the AWS CLI. Validate that the files were migrated, and publish the code commit repository. B. Create the code commit repository using the AWS Management Console. Clone both the Git and code commit repositories to the local computer. Copy the files from the Git repository to the code commit repository on the local computer. Commit the code commit repository. Validate that the files were migrated, and share the code commit repository. C. Create the code commit repository using the AWS Management Console. Use the console to clone the Git repository into the code commit repository. Validate that the files were migrated, and publish the code commit repository. D. Create the code commit repository using the AWS Management Console or the AWS CLI. Clone the Git repository with a mirror argument to the local computer and push the repository to code commit. Validate that the files were migrated, and share the code commit repository. Correct answer, B. A company is using AWS to deploy an application. The development team must automate the deployments. The team has created an AWS code pipeline to deploy the application to Amazon EC2 instances using AWS Code Deploy after it has been built using AWS Code Build. The team wants to add automated testing to the pipeline to confirm that the application is healthy before deploying the code to the EC2 instances. The team also requires a manual approval action before the application is deployed, even if the tests are successful. The testing and approval must be accomplished at the lowest costs, using the simplest management solution. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Create a manual approval action after the build action of the pipeline. Use Amazon Asynchronous to inform the team of the stage being triggered. Next, add a test action using code build to perform the required tests. At the end of the pipeline, add a deploy action to deploy the application to the next stage. B. Create a test action after the code build of the pipeline. Configure the action to use code build to perform the required tests. If these tests are successful, mark the action as successful. Add a manual approval action that uses Amazon Asynchronous to notify the team, and add a deploy action to deploy the application to the next stage. C. Create a new pipeline that uses a source action that gets the code from the same repository as the first pipeline. Add a deploy action to deploy the code to a test environment. Use a test action using AWS Lambda to test the deployment. Add a manual approval action by using Amazon Asynchronous to notify the team, and add a deploy action to deploy the application to the next stage. D. Create a test action after the build action. Use a Jenkins server on Amazon EC2 to perform the required tests and mark the action as successful if the tests pass. Create a manual approval action that uses Amazon SQS to notify the team and add a deploy action to deploy the application to the next stage. Correct answer, B. A DevOps engineer wants to deploy a serverless web application that is based on AWS Lambda. The deployment must meet the following requirements: provide staging and production environments. Restrict developers from accessing the production environment. Avoid hard-coding passwords in the Lambda functions. Store source code in AWS Code Commit. Use AWS Code Pipeline to automate the deployment. What is the most operationally efficient solution that meets these requirements? A. Create separate staging and production accounts to segregate deployment targets. Use AWS Key Management Service, AWS KMS, to store environment-specific values. Use Code Pipeline to automate deployments with AWS Code Deploy. B. Create separate staging and production accounts to segregate deployment targets. Use Lambda environment variables to store environment-specific values. Use Code Pipeline to automate deployments with AWS Code Deploy. C. Define tagging conventions for staging and production environments to segregate deployment targets. Use AWS Key Management Service, AWS KMS, to store environment-specific values. Use Code Pipeline to automate deployments with AWS Code Deploy. D. Define tagging conventions for staging and production environments to segregate deployment targets. Use Lambda environment variables to store environment-specific values. Use Code Pipeline to automate deployments with AWS Code Deploy. Correct answer, B. Welcome to my videos. AWS DevOps Engineer, Professional Latest Exam Questions and Answers Set 4. A company wants to use AWS development tools to replace its current Bash deployment scripts. The company currently deploys a LAMP application to a group of Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. During the deployments, the company unit tests the committed application, stops and starts services, unregisters and re-registers instances with the load balancer, and updates file permissions. The company wants to maintain the same deployment functionality through the shift to using AWS services. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Use AWS Code Build to test the application. Use Bash scripts invoked by AWS Code Deploy's appspec.yml file to restart services, and deregister and register instances with the ALB. Use the appspec.yml file to update file permissions without a custom script. B. Use AWS Code Pipeline to move the application from the AWS Code Commit repository to AWS Code Deploy. Use Code Deploy's deployment group to test the application, unregister and re-register instances with the ALB, and restart services. Use the appspec.yml file to update the permissions without a custom script. C. Use AWS code pipeline to move the application source code from the AWS code commit repository to AWS code deploy. Use code deploy to test the application. Use code deploy's appspec.yml file to restart services and update permissions without a custom script. Use AWS code build to unregister and re-register instances with the ALB. D. Use AWS code pipeline to trigger AWS code build to test the application. Use bash scripts invoked by AWS code deploy's appspec.yml file to restart services. Unregister and re-register the instances in the AWS code deploy deployment group with the ALB. Update the appspec.yml file to update file permissions without a custom script. Correct answer, B. A company gives its employees limited rights to AWS. DevOps engineers have the ability to assume an administrator role. For checking purposes, the security team wants to receive a near real-time notification when the administrator role is assumed. How should this be accomplished? A. Configure AWS config to publish logs to an Amazon S3 bucket. Use Amazon Athena to query the logs and send a notification to the security team when the administrator role is assumed. B. Configure Amazon GuardDuty to monitor when the administrator role is assumed and send a notification to the security team. C. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, event rule using an AWS Management Console sign an events event pattern that publishes a message to an Amazon SNS topic if the administrator role is assumed. D. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events rule using an AWS API call that uses an AWS CloudTrail event pattern to trigger an AWS Lambda function that publishes a message to an Amazon SNS topic if the administrator role is assumed. Correct answer, C. An e-commerce company uses a large number of Amazon EBS-backed Amazon EC2 instances. To decrease manual work across all the instances, a DevOps engineer is tasked with automating restart actions when EC2 instance retirement events are scheduled. How can this be accomplished? A. Create a scheduled Amazon CloudWatch Events rule to execute an AWS Systems Manager automation document that checks if any EC2 instances are scheduled for retirement once a week. If the instance is scheduled for retirement, the automation document will hibernate the instance. B. Enable EC2 auto recovery on all of the instances. Create an AWS config rule to limit the recovery to occur during a maintenance window only. C. Reboot all EC2 instances during an approved maintenance window that is outside of standard business hours. Set up Amazon CloudWatch alarms to send a notification in case any instance is failing EC2 instance status checks. D. Set up an AWS Health Amazon CloudWatch Events rule to execute AWS Systems Manager automation documents that stop and start the EC2 instance when a retirement scheduled event occurs. Correct answer, D. A company that runs many workloads on AWS has an Amazon EBS spend that has increased over time. The DevOps team notices there are many unattached EBS volumes. Although there are workloads where volumes are detached, volumes over 14 days old are stale and no longer needed. A DevOps engineer has been tasked with creating automation that deletes unattached EBS volumes that have been unattached for 14 days. Which solution will accomplish this? A. Configure the AWS config ec2 volume in use check managed rule with a configuration changes trigger type and an Amazon EC2 volume resource target. Create a new Amazon CloudWatch Events rule scheduled to execute an AWS Lambda function in 14 days to delete the specified EBS volume. B. Use Amazon EC2 and Amazon Data Lifecycle Manager to configure a volume lifecycle policy. Set the interval period for unattached EBS volumes to 14 days and set the retention rule to delete. Set the policy target volumes as C. Create an Amazon CloudWatch Events rule to execute an AWS Lambda function daily. The Lambda function should find unattached EBS volumes and tag them with the current date, and delete unattached volumes that have tags with dates that are more than 14 days old. D. Use AWS Trusted Advisor to detect EBS volumes that have been detached for more than 14 days. Execute an AWS Lambda function that creates a snapshot and then deletes the EBS volume. Correct answer, B. A company has multiple child accounts that are part of an organization in AWS organizations. The security team needs to review every Amazon EC2 security group and their inbound and outbound rules. The security team wants to programmatically retrieve this information from the child accounts using an AWS Lambda function in the management account of the organization. Which combination of access changes will meet these requirements? Choose 3. A. Create a trust relationship that allows users in the child accounts to assume the management account IAM role. B. Create a trust relationship that allows users in the management account to assume the IAM roles of the child accounts. C. Create an IAM role in each child account that has access to the Amazon EC2 read-only access managed policy. D. Create an IAM role in each child account to allow the STS assume role action against the management account IAM roles ARN. E. Create an IAM role in the management account that allows the STS assume role action against the child account IAM roles ARN. F. Create an IAM role in the management account that has access to the Amazon EC2 read-only access managed policy. Correct answer, B, C, E. An application is deployed on Amazon EC2 instances running in an auto-scaling group. During the bootstrapping process, the instances register their private IP addresses with a monitoring system. The monitoring system performs health checks frequently by sending ping requests to those IP addresses and sending alerts if an instance becomes non-responsive. The existing deployment strategy replaces the current EC2 instances with new ones. A DevOps engineer has noticed that the monitoring system is sending false alarms during a deployment, and is tasked with stopping these false alarms. Which solution will meet these requirements without affecting the current deployment method? A. Define an Amazon CloudWatch events target, an AWS Lambda function, and a lifecycle hook attached to the autoscaling group. Configure CloudWatch events to invoke Amazon Asynchronous to send a message to the system's administrator group for remediation. B. Define an AWS Lambda function and a lifecycle hook attached to the autoscaling group. Configure the lifecycle hook to invoke the Lambda function, which removes the entry of the private IP from the monitoring system upon instance termination. C. Define an Amazon CloudWatch events target, an AWS Lambda function, and a lifecycle hook attached to the autoscaling group. Configure CloudWatch events to invoke the Lambda function, which removes the entry of the private IP from the monitoring system upon instance termination. D. Define an AWS Lambda function that will run a script when instance termination occurs in an auto-scaling group. The script will remove the entry of the private IP from the monitoring system. Correct answer, C. An e-commerce company is running a web application in an AWS Elastic Beanstalk environment. In recent months, the average load of the Amazon EC2 instances has been increased to handle more traffic. The company would like to improve the scalability and resilience of the environment. The development team has been asked to decouple long-running tasks from the environment if the tasks can be executed asynchronously. Examples of these tasks include confirmation emails when users are registered to the platform, and processing images or videos. Also, some of the periodic tasks that are currently running within the web server should be offloaded. What is the most time-efficient and integrated way to achieve this? A. Create an Amazon SQS and send the tasks that should be decoupled from the Elastic Beanstalk web server environment to the SQS queue. Create a fleet of EC2 instances under an auto-scaling group. Use an AMI that contains the application to process the asynchronous tasks. Configure the application to listen for messages within the SQS queue, and create periodic tasks by placing those into the cron in the operating system. Create an environment variable within the Elastic Beanstalk environment with a value pointing to the SQS queue endpoint. B. Create a second Elastic Beanstalk worker tier environment and deploy the application to process the asynchronous tasks there. Send the tasks that should be decoupled from the original Elastic Beanstalk web server environment to the auto-generated Amazon SQS queue by the Elastic Beanstalk worker environment. Place a cron.yaml file within the root of the application source bundle for the worker environment for periodic tasks. Use environment links to link the web server environment with the worker environment. C. Create a second Elastic Beanstalk web server tier environment and deploy the application to process the asynchronous tasks. Send the tasks that should be decoupled from the original Elastic Beanstalk web server to the auto-generated Amazon SQS by the second Elastic Beanstalk web server tier environment. Place a cron.yaml file within the root of the application source bundle for the second web server tier environment with the necessary periodic tasks. Use environment links to link both web server environments. D. Create an Amazon SQS and send the tasks that should be decoupled from the Elastic Beanstalk web server environment to the SQS. Create a fleet of EC2 instances under an auto-scaling group. Install and configure the application to listen for messages within the SQS from user data and create periodic tasks by placing those into the cron in the operating system. Create an environment variable within the Elastic Beanstalk web server environment with a value pointing to the SQS endpoint. Correct answer, B. A company has an on-premises that is written in Go. A DevOps engineer must move the application to AWS. The company's development team wants to enable blue/green deployments and perform A/B testing. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Deploy the application on an Amazon EC2 instance and create an AMI of this instance. Use this AMI to create an automatic scaling launch configuration that is used in an auto-scaling group. Use an elastic load balancer to distribute traffic. When changes are made to the application, a new AMI will be created, which will initiate an EC2 instance refresh. B. Use Amazon Lifecycle to deploy the application. Store the application in a zipped format in an Amazon S3 bucket. Use this zipped version to deploy new versions of the application to Lifecycle. Use Lifecycle deployment options to manage the deployment. C. Use AWS Code Artifact to store the application code. Use AWS Code Deploy to deploy the application to a fleet of Amazon EC2 instances. Use Elastic Load Balancing to distribute the traffic to the EC2 instances. When making changes to the application, upload a new version to Code Artifact and create a new Code Deploy deployment. D. Use AWS Elastic Beanstalk to host the application. Store zipped version of the application in Amazon S3, and use that location to deploy new versions of the application using Elastic Beanstalk to manage the deployment options. Correct answer, B. An application runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. A DevOps engineer is using AWS Code Deploy to release a new version. The deployment fails during the allow traffic lifecycle event, but a cause for the failure is not indicated in the deployment logs. What would cause this? A. The appspec.yml file contains an invalid script to execute in the allow traffic lifecycle hook. B. The user who initiated the deployment does not have the necessary permissions to interact with the ALB. C. The health checks specified for the ALB target group are misconfigured. D. The code deploy agent was not installed in the EC2 instances that are part of the ALB target group. Correct answer, C. A company has a single developer writing code for an automated deployment pipeline. The developer is storing source code in an Amazon S3 bucket for each project. The company wants to add more developers to the team but is concerned about code conflicts and lost work. The company also wants to build a test environment to deploy newer versions of code for testing and allow developers to automatically deploy to both environments when code is changed in the repository. What is the most efficient way to meet these requirements? A. Create an AWS code commit repository for each project, use the main branch for production code, and create a testing branch for code deployed to testing. Use feature branches to develop new features and pull requests to merge code to testing and main branches. B. Create another S3 bucket for each project for testing code, and use an AWS Lambda function to promote code changes between testing and production buckets. Enable versioning on all buckets to prevent code conflicts. C. Create an AWS code commit repository for each project, and use the main branch for production and test code with different deployment pipelines for each environment. Use feature branches to develop new features. D. Enable versioning and branching on each S3 bucket, use the main branch for production code, and create a testing branch for code deployed to testing. Have developers use each branch for developing in each environment. Correct answer, B. A development team is building an e-commerce application and is using Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, to send order messages to multiple endpoints. One of the endpoints is an external HTTP endpoint that is not always available. The development team needs to receive a notification if an order message is not delivered to the HTTP endpoint. What should a DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? A. Create an Amazon Simple Queue service, Amazon SQS, queue. On the SNS topic, configure a redrive policy that sends undelivered messages to the SQS queue. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the new SQS queue to notify the development team when messages are delivered to the queue. B. Create an Amazon Simple Queue service, Amazon SQS, queue. On the HTTP endpoint subscription of the SNS topic, configure a redrive policy that sends undelivered messages to the SQS queue. Create an Amazon CloudWatch alarm for the new SQS queue to notify the development team when messages are delivered to the queue. C. On the SNS topic, configure an HTTPS delivery policy that will retry delivery until the order message is delivered successfully. Configure the backoff function parameter in the policy to notify the development team when a message cannot be delivered within the set constraints. D. On the HTTP endpoint subscription of the SNS topic, configure an HTTPS delivery policy that will retry delivery until the order message is delivered successfully. Configure the backoff function parameter in the policy to notify the development team when a message cannot be delivered within the set constraints. Correct answer, C. A company is deploying a container-based application using AWS code build. The security team mandates that all containers are scanned for vulnerabilities prior to deployment using a password-protected endpoint. All sensitive information must be stored securely. Which solution should be used to meet these requirements? A. Encrypt the password using AWS KMS. Store the encrypted password in the buildspec.yml file as an environment variable under the variables mapping. Reference the environment variable to initiate scanning. B. Import the password into an AWS Cloud HSM key. Reference the Cloud HSM key in the buildspec.yml file as an environment variable under the variables mapping. Reference the environment variable to initiate scanning. C. Store the password in the AWS Systems Manager parameter store as a secure string. Add the parameter store key to the buildspec.yml file as an environment variable under the parameter store mapping. Reference the environment variable to initiate scanning. D. Use the AWS Encryption SDK to encrypt the password and embed in the buildspec.yml file as a variable under the secrets mapping. Attach a policy to code build to enable access to the required decryption key. Correct answer, C. An engineering team manages a Node.js e-commerce application. The current environment consists of the following components: Amazon S3 buckets for storing content, Amazon EC2 for the front-end web servers, AWS Lambda for image processing, Amazon DynamoDB for storing session-related data. The team expects a significant increase in traffic to the site. The application should handle the additional load without interruption. The team ran initial tests by adding new servers to the EC2 frontend to handle the larger load, but the instances took up to 20 minutes to become fully configured. The team wants to reduce this configuration time. What changes will the engineering team need to implement to make the solution the most resilient and highly available while meeting the expected increase in demand? A. Use AWS OpsWorks to automatically configure each new EC2 instance as it is launched. Configure the EC2 instances by using an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer across multiple availability zones. Implement Amazon DynamoDB auto-scaling. Use Amazon Route 53 to point the application DNS record to the application load balancer. B. Deploy a fleet of EC2 instances, doubling the current capacity, and place them behind an application load balancer. Increase the Amazon DynamoDB read and write capacity units. Add an alias record that contains the application load balancer endpoint to the existing Amazon Route 53 DNS record that points to the application. C. Configure Amazon CloudFront and have its origin point to Amazon S3 to host the web application. Implement Amazon DynamoDB auto-scaling. Use Amazon Route 53 to point the application DNS record to the CloudFront DNS name. D. Use AWS Elastic Beanstalk with a custom AMI including all web components. Deploy the platform by using an auto-scaling group behind an application load balancer across multiple availability zones. Implement Amazon DynamoDB auto-scaling. Use Amazon Route 53 to point the application DNS record to the Elastic Beanstalk load balancer. Correct answer, D. A company's application development team uses Linux-based Amazon EC2 instances as bastion hosts. Inbound SSH access to the bastion hosts is restricted to specific IP addresses, as defined in the associated security groups. The company's security team wants to receive a notification if the security group rules are modified to allow SSH access from any IP address. What should a DevOps engineer do to meet this requirement? A. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, rule with a source of AWS.CloudTrail and the event name authorize security group ingress. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as the target. B. Enable Amazon Guard Duty and check the findings for security group in AWS Security Hub. Configure an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, rule with a custom pattern that matches Guard Duty events with an output of non-compliant. Define an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic as the target. C. Create an AWS config rule by using the restricted SSH managed rule to check whether security groups disallow unrestricted incoming SSH traffic. Configure automatic remediation to publish a message to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. D. Enable Amazon Inspector. Include the common vulnerabilities and exposures 1.1 rules package to check the security groups that are associated with the bastion hosts. Configure Amazon Inspector to publish a message to an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic. Correct answer, C. A company is using AWS organizations to create separate AWS accounts for each of its departments. The company needs to automate the following tasks: update the Linux AMIs with new patches periodically and generate a golden image. Install a new version of Chef agents in the golden image. If available, provide the newly generated AMIs to the department's accounts. Which solution meets these requirements with the least management overhead? A. Write a script to launch an Amazon EC2 instance from the previous golden image. Apply the patch updates. Install the new version of the Chef agent, generate a new golden image, and then modify the AMI permissions to share only the new image with the department's accounts. B. Use Amazon EC2 Image Builder to create an image pipeline that consists of the base Linux AMI and components to install the Chef agent. Use AWS Resource Access Manager to share EC2 Image Builder images with the department's accounts. C. Use an AWS Systems Manager automation runbook to update the Linux AMI by using the previous image. Provide the URL for the script that will update the Chef agent. Use AWS organizations to replace the previous golden image in the department's accounts. D. Use Amazon EC2 Image Builder to create an image pipeline that consists of the base Linux AMI and components to install the Chef agent. Create a parameter in AWS Systems Manager parameter store to store the new AMI ID that can be referenced by the department's accounts. Correct answer, B. A company has an application that runs on 12 Amazon EC2 instances. The instances run in an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group across 3 availability zones. On a typical day, each EC2 instance has 30% CPU utilization during business hours and 10% CPU utilization after business hours. The CPU utilization increases suddenly in the first few minutes of business hours each day. Other increases in CPU utilization are gradual. A DevOps engineer needs to optimize costs while maintaining or improving the application's reliability. Which solution meets these requirements? A. Configure a target tracking scaling policy that is based on the auto-scaling group's average CPU utilization, and set a target of 75%. Create a scheduled action for the auto-scaling group to adjust the desired capacity to 6 instances just before business hours begin. B. Configure the auto-scaling group with 2 scheduled actions for Amazon EC2 auto-scaling. Configure one action to start 9 EC2 instances at the start of business hours. Configure the other action to stop 9 instances at the end of business hours. C. Change to an AWS application auto-scaling group. Configure a target tracking scaling policy that is based on the auto-scaling group's average CPU utilization, and set a target of 75%. Create a scheduled action for the auto-scaling group to adjust the minimum number of instances to 3 instances at the end of business hours and to reset the number to 6 instances before business hours begin. D. Change to an AWS application auto-scaling group. Configure a target tracking scaling policy that is based on the auto-scaling group's average CPU utilization, and set a target of 75%. Create a scheduled action to terminate 9 instances each evening at the end of business hours. Correct answer, D. A development team is building a full-stack serverless web application. The serverless application will consist of a backend REST API and a front-end that is built with a single-page application, SPA, framework. The team wants to use a Git-based workflow to develop and deploy the application. The team has created an AWS code commit repository to store the application code. The team wants to use multiple development branches to test new features. In addition, the team wants to ensure that code changes on the development branches are deployed to the different development environments. Code changes to the main branches must be released automatically to production. The development deployments must be available as a subdomain of the main application website, which is hosted in an Amazon Route 53 public hosted zone. What should a DevOps engineer do to meet these requirements? A. Create an application in the AWS Amplify console, and connect the code commit repository. Create a feature branch deployment for each of the environments. Connect the Route 53 domain to the application. Activate the automatic creation of subdomains. B. Create a single AWS code pipeline that uses the code commit repository as a source. Configure the pipeline so that it deploys to different environments based on the changed branch. Create an AWS Lambda function that creates a new subdomain based on the source branch name. Invoke the Lambda function in the deployment workflow. C. Create an application in AWS Elastic Beanstalk that uses the code commit repository as a source. Configure Elastic Beanstalk so that it creates a new application environment based on the changed branch. Connect the Route 53 domain to the application. Activate the automatic creation of subdomains. D. Create multiple AWS code pipelines that use the code commit repository as a source. Configure each pipeline so that it deploys to a specific environment based on the configured branch. Configure an AWS code deploy step in the pipeline to deploy the application components and to create the Route 53 public hosted zone. Correct answer, D. A company is using AWS code pipeline to deploy an application. According to a new guideline, a member of the company's security team must sign off on any application changes before the changes are deployed into production. The approval must be recorded and retained. Which combination of actions will meet these requirements? Choose 2. A. Configure code pipeline to write actions to Amazon CloudWatch logs. B. Configure code pipeline to write actions to an Amazon S3 bucket at the end of each pipeline stage. C. Create an AWS CloudTrail to deliver logs to Amazon S3. D. Create a code pipeline custom action to invoke an AWS Lambda function for approval. Create a policy that gives the security team access to manage code pipeline custom actions. E. Create a code pipeline manual approval action before the deployment step. Create a policy that grants the security team access to approve manual approval stages. Correct answer, C. E. A company manages a web application that runs on Amazon EC2 instances behind an application load balancer, ALB. The EC2 instances run in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. The application uses an Amazon RDS from MySQL DB instance to store the data. The company has configured Amazon Route 53 with an alias record that points to the ALB. A new company guideline requires a geographically isolated disaster recovery, DR, site with an RTO of 4 hours and an RPO of 15 minutes. Which DR strategy will meet these requirements with the least change to the application stack? A. Launch a replica environment of everything except Amazon RDS in a different availability zone. Create an RDS read replica in the new availability zone, and configure the new stack to point to the local RDS DB instance. Add the new stack to the Route 53 record set by using a health check to configure a failover routing policy. B. Launch a replica environment of everything except Amazon RDS in a different AWS region. Create an RDS read replica in the new region, and configure the new stack to point to the local RDS DB instance. Add the new stack to the Route 53 record set by using a health check to configure a latency routing policy. C. Launch a replica environment of everything except Amazon RDS in a different AWS region. In the event of an outage, copy and restore the latest RDS snapshot from the primary region to the DR region. Adjust the Route 53 record set to point to the ALB in the DR region. D. Launch a replica environment of everything except Amazon RDS in a different AWS region. Create an RDS read replica in the new region, and configure the new environment to point to the local RDS DB instance. Add the new stack to the Route 53 record set by using a health check to configure a failover routing policy. In the event of an outage, promote the read replicate to primary. Correct answer, C. A DevOps engineer wants to implement an automated response that will occur if AWS Trusted Advisor detects an IAM access key in a public source code repository. The automated response must delete the exposed access key and must notify the security team. Which solution will meet these requirements? A. Create an AWS Lambda function to delete the 1 IAM access key. Configure AWS CloudTrail logs to stream to Amazon CloudWatch logs. Create a CloudWatch logs metric filter for the AWS_risk_credentials_exposed event with 2 actions. First, run the Lambda function. Second, use Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, to send a notification to the security team. B. Create an AWS Lambda function to delete the IAM access key. Create an AWS config rule for changes to AWS.TrustAdvisor and the exposed access keys status with 2 actions. First, run the Lambda function. Second, use Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, to send a notification to the security team. C. Create an AWS Lambda function that deletes the IAM access key and then uses Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, to notify the security team. Create an AWS Personal Health Dashboard rule for the AWS_risk_credentials_exposed event. Set the target of the Personal Health Dashboard rule to the ARN of the Lambda function. D. Create an AWS Lambda function that deletes the IAM access key. Create an Amazon Event Bridge, Amazon CloudWatch Events, rule with an AWS.TrustAdvisor event source and the exposed access keys status. Set the Event Bridge, CloudWatch Events, rule to target the Lambda function and an Amazon Simple Notification Service, Amazon SNS, topic that notifies the security team. Correct answer, D.